Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bharat Gopalaswamy, and I'm the director of the South Asia Center. On behalf of my colleagues at the Atlantic Council and also my co-mischief creator, Lucian Crowder at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, I'd like to invite you to this discussion on space weapons and the risk of nuclear exchange. To give you a bit of context, the original mischief was conceived by Lucian earlier this year, earlier in 2015, when he invited Nancy Gallagher, a Chinese colleague named Wu Chunxi, and myself for a discussion, an online roundtable at the Bulletin. And I think it's still available. The URL is still available, and if you're interested, Lucian could provide you with the URL. And we thought of bringing this discussion live to Washington, D.C. So today, as you all recognize, is the 9th anniversary of the Chinese anti-satellite weapon test. And we wanted to coincide this discussion with this anniversary so that we wanted to find out like where we stand on this subject today. So with me, I have colleagues. We're extremely delighted to welcome Mallory Stewart, who's a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Emerging Security Challenges and Defense Policy from the Bureau of Arms Control Verification and Compliance at the U.S. Department of State. And followed by that, we have an expert panelist that will round up the discussion. So the discussion will proceed as follows. I'll now invite Mallory to give her opening remarks. She has her brief remarks. Her remarks are on the record, and she's open, and she will take question and answers from you. Followed that, my colleague Lucian will be moderating a discussion between the panelists. Thank you, Mallory.
Thank you so much for having me here today, and to the Atlantic Council for having me on this somewhat notorious anniversary, the 9th one of the Chinese anti-satellite test that created what some have conservatively estimated to be 1/6 of the existing radar trackable debris in outer space in 2007. And to this day, that will continue for decades. I know it's sort of a very well-educated crowd on these issues, so I thought that I'd have very, very brief remarks and then hopefully have some good questions to lead into what will be undoubtedly a very interesting roundtable conversation. What I find to be the interesting part about the 2007 satellite test, anti-satellite test, is that there have been subsequent tests by China, but none of them have been debris generating. So at the State Department, we like to attribute that to the huge international outcry that has been effectively sort of encouraged by diplomacy in large part by the State Department and others, saying that this was a remarkable incident of irresponsible behavior. And maybe that was the reason, and hopefully it was. And we can talk about some of the diplomatic initiatives that we're pursuing now to continue to inspire responsible behavior in space on both a bilateral and a multilateral front. It could also have been that China itself realized it had to maneuver several times to avoid the debris from its own anti-satellite tests. And it came to some level of strategic restraint, just as the US and the USSR came to in the Cold War, when they themselves were doing their own anti-satellite testing. So assuming from a diplomat's perspective that it was the diplomatic initiatives and the outcry that prevented China from continuing to do debris-generating tests in 2007, I want to briefly touch on some of the diplomatic initiatives that we're doing to further encourage responsible behavior and to dissuade irresponsible activities such as massive debris generation events. So we have outreach through space security dialogues that we have with our partners and allies around the world. And in those dialogues, we try to engage in a joint threat assessment sharing. We engage in, hopefully, space situational awareness sharing. And we also try to develop the resiliency of our space assets, either by coordinating the technologies that we use or sharing our understanding of what our assets are capable of, and hopefully leading to greater resilience in space of our collective systems. This is an important initiative that the State Department certainly wants to pursue over the next year and in coming years to encourage the annual occurrence of these space security dialogues with more and more partners. And I should highlight in that one discussion that the space situational awareness is something that if we can spread as broadly as possible through State Department initiatives or DoD initiatives, we can have a greater chance for attribution and accountability in space, which has largely been a chaotic domain. I think the talking points that we've probably all heard for the last several years are the 3 C's: congested, contested, and competitive, because U.S. government folks love alliteration. So we are trying to develop as much situational awareness as possible across the board, so we all know what's going on, and we can talk about it, and we can prevent another alliteration: miscommunication, misperception, and miscalculation, which is certainly something that we do try to avoid. So in addition to our space security dialogues, we also try to engage on the multilateral level in norms development to try to lead to responsible behavior in space. And this can be done either through the GGE group of experts conversation about the need for the development of transparency and confidence building measures in space. It could be done through what we had tried to engage in last year in New York, the code of conduct discussions that were not ultimately successful, but did lay the groundwork for, I think, subsequent clarity and work on additional principles that we can all adhere to, and also through COPUS's long-term sustainability initiatives. So that's some of the things we're working on. I sort of feel like I want to see what you have questions about and then talk more about those specific areas, if you'll humor me. So does anyone have any particular questions? I know I just kind of very briefly touched on topics. Sure. Oh, do we have a mic?
Hi, Mallory. Victoria Sampson, Ski World Foundation. I was interested to hear the fact that SSA sharing is part of these dialogues you have bilaterally. Mm-hmm. I'm curious to know, is it one-way, two-way? What do you guys do when you work with a country that does not have their own SSA collection capabilities? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, certainly, DoD does it more directly through bilateral agreements and bilateral arrangements, but we encourage close coordination and communication depending on what the other country is interested in. So, the situational awareness capacity that we discuss with them is either, working more closely with our DoD colleagues to set up a direct agreement if that's something that is a possibility, or we, talk about our spacetrack.org capabilities, and we talk about our desire to share with them our understanding of what's happening in space. So it's kind of a sort of more fulsome way to address what they're interested in space security. I can't say in space situational awareness, I can't say in any particular country which they may prefer, what kind of engagement they may prefer, but we're certainly open to coordination and collaboration on the situational awareness front. And thankfully our national space policy, encourages us to do international outreach and to engage with our international allies to encourage a more sustainable space environment. And I think situational awareness is important in that sort of conversation. So no one answer to that question, but certainly open to a lot of conversations on this. What about the code of conduct? Does anyone have questions about that? That was sort of a hot topic for a period of time, which I'm happy to talk about.
Thank you. Lee Bollier, Voice of America. There have been a lot of discussion about the norm development, but there are a lot of skepticism. They're saying that some countries just not gonna follow them, even you have the norm, because many incidents in the past suggest that it's hard to enforce. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us the value of having this kind of a norm that will be pursued and enforced by everybody? Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So, we certainly see norms development of having the potential to do what we were able to do with respect to the 2007 anti-satellite test, which is to dissuade bad behavior or to make it something that needs to be either sort of actively prevented or done in a very sort of subtle way, so that they kind of avoid the outcry. I mean, we think that the norms have to prevent sort of the outward acceptance of bad behavior in space. And so, certainly there's concerns that it's non-binding. That's one of the concerns we've heard, so people aren't going to comply with that. But I don't really think that's true, because we have seen the effect, again, of having, outcry and disagreement with actions that have been open and apparent. If there's some movement to try to avoid a sort of the outcry, then we can we can see if countries are maybe taking less public events or less public actions and maybe try to address those in another way. And, I think the code was interesting because it highlighted some of the things we need to establish before we can effectively achieve sort of the rules of responsible behavior in space for a broader audience than just the COPUOS community. There was a lot of questions raised about definitions and a lot of misunderstanding about what terminology we were using. One country's definition of space weapon doesn't match another country's definition of space weapon, and we've had the problem across the board where a completely civil-oriented and peaceful use of space is accused by another country of being sort of a weaponization of space, and that's a big problem. And so the code highlighted that we need to come to some consensus on these basic terms, on the basic understandings of what's either going on, what's being utilized, why the dual-use nature makes this term weapon so difficult. But once we can come to a basic consensus on those issues and try to find some principles that we can all agree from the code, then we could really move forward to, first potentially a responsible behavior, political commitment, and then potentially a long-term treaty if we can get to the point in which it's, we all work from the same definitions and it's verifiable and we can have some value from that legal mechanism. But what we don't want to do is jump into a treaty headlong without understanding what the definitions we're dealing with and without it being verifiable, and potentially fill the field with a legal document that then really doesn't have as much merit because we didn't have the same understanding of where we were starting from, or really how we would verify it. So, it's not that we don't want to ever get to legal constructs in space. I think that would be useful. It's just trying to figure out how to get there in a really informed manner from the same sort of starting point and with the same understandings. Yeah.
Madhu Khan, 3 Analytics. 2 questions. In your Office of Emerging Security Challenges, where does this challenge rank? That's the first question. And then, do you see a role for commercial companies to help negotiate a more secure space environment? Thank you.
So ranking of emerging security challenges, I've never actually done that. I think it just depends who you ask. I certainly think space and cyber have unique attributes that make them very difficult to address in certain contexts and also make them sort of a more urgent issue in other ways of looking at it. I also handle chemical and biological weapons, and I would say that those two, and especially biology, have a lot of emerging concerns. I'm not sure I can rank them just because I think it depends on any given day, my level of concern about each of them, but certainly space is very far up there, which is sort of funny to say. But, clearly the debris issue makes it all the more urgent. And the fact that it's becoming, again, these 3 Cs, congested, contested, and competitive. And it's not just becoming, it has been for some time, and it's getting more so. And we also, in the US and elsewhere, have a great reliance on space. So if you make that environment more difficult to deal with, you're essentially disabling something that's crucial to all of our industries, all of our government work. So something that's crucial to almost everything we do. So, sorry, your follow-up question, which I thought was really important now, which one was that again? The role of commercial companies. Yes. So space is also very interesting because it has this growing non-state actor presence, right? That commercial entities are now sort of realizing that space is this amazing place to get stuff done. Both terrestrial-based companies are saying, okay, well, we need satellite capabilities, we need to do this, we need to work with this, but also you have these entrepreneurs that are talking about going into space and doing some great work up there. You also have limited resources from governments that are sort of forcing some of the outlets to a commercial capacity. So commercial players have to be a part of any conversation. In terms of norms development, I would think they're sort of one of the most crucial communities to bring in and very closely work with the governments as to what is a possible norm that should be utilized and what their understanding of when things are getting too close or when we need to communicate, this notification concept, when we need to talk to each other. I mean, all of that is crucial to have the commercial players to be part of that conversation. So absolutely. And to the extent that there's very close communication with certain companies now, I think it's only going to sort of expand across the board. It just as in cyber, there's going to need to be, as there has been, a very close cooperation with the commercial side. in cyber, it's almost more because as we were just discussing before this, it developed in a different context. So the commercial side is almost more the leader sometimes than the governments. In space, it was the reverse, and the governments were there first. So it's a little bit easier to sort of bring them in now to the conversation versus trying to ask in the cyber world the commercial side to let us in. But it's certainly a conversation that is only going to grow, and a collaboration that has to work if you're going to develop norms, if you're going to develop sort of the most responsible behavior across the board. So, yeah, thank you. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Pierce Corden with the American Association for Advancement of Science. In some of the advertisements for this event, there was a link between the outer space security portfolio, if you will, and the risks posed by nuclear weapons in that portfolio. I imagine the discussion will get into that in some detail, but do you have anything you want to just sort of say about that immediately?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to discuss that a little bit. I know you guys will have a more fulsome conversation in the roundtable, but certainly I touched very briefly on this concept of strategic restraint, and the understanding in the Cold War that there were certain sort of early warning capabilities that we didn't want to have threatened in space on either side. And I think, there is a concept of exercising a certain amount of restraint on space assets when you know that there's larger issues, when the threat that you feel, that a country feels in space, translates into a terrestrial greater sort of significance. And it's kind of an obtuse way of saying that the space security and situational awareness and preventing conflict from extending into space is meant to eliminate a sort of a, the Cold War nuclear conversation from happening in space, right? We want to prevent conflict in space. We want to prevent a feeling of insecurity in space so that we don't have to live on the edge of our seats with respect to things happening. And so, I think that, and maybe that's where the roundtable will go. I hadn't really discussed this with the moderator or the speakers yet, but I think, it is an interesting question as to how nuclear politics plays out in space in the long term, and really. What I see as my role, and what I see as the role of our bureau in the State Department, is try to maintain space stability, try to establish greater situational awareness for everyone, and try to eliminate sort of the threat-based analysis of our activities, and try to prevent people from assuming that whatever we do is sort of threat-oriented, but actually is civil-minded and is working for the greater good, and adhering to the National Space Policy's mandate that space should be open to everyone for use and for research and for free passage. So I see the connection. I appreciate that this conversation is going to get more into a sort of direct nuclear space connection. But in my mind, it's preventing a, zero-sum game in space. It's preventing the mutually assured destruction in space. It's trying to prevent us from moving into you take our satellite, we'll take out yours, and not getting to that point. It's preventing the conflict from extending to space. So it's a little bit of hoping that the nuclear politics that we have on Earth won't have to, get into a space conversation.
Hi, you know me. I'm Teresa Hitchens with the Center for International and Security Studies at Maryland. In 2013, the UN group of governmental experts came out with a consensus report that made some recommendations about how to go forward with transparency and confidence building in space. And I just wondered, since then, what has been, if anything, implemented?
Well, I mean, the code, we viewed it as a really good implementation of the GGE's report. We viewed it as a squarely on point with respect to the development of TCBMs, with respect to the activities taken to bring about notification, bring about greater coordination and cooperation, even having a forum for conversation as to what questions are emerging in space cooperation realms. The code didn't work, but I do think that the GGE provides a good sort of multilaterally accepted basis to push forward implementing some of the TCBMs that were addressed in the code conversations. And I think it's actually a good source for multilateral cooperation on implementation, and maybe even a way to bring in some of those actors that weren't as squarely involved in the GGE. I mean, if we could have a conversation bringing in the countries that may not have been on that panel of experts, but talking about how each country can implement through national policies, through coordination, I think I think that GGE group, and not just because my Assistant Secretary Frank Rose was on that panel of experts, but because I think it was so multilaterally endorsed, and it really provides what I think is a good source for framing implementation going forward from all the countries. Now, there's always a problem of putting sort of a general consensus opinion into specifics, or making people actually do what they say they're going to do. But if we can talk about our national policies, and the U.S. is always happy to talk about what we do in the space realm, through our national policies, through our debris mitigation, and if every country can come together and talk about their national policies on space, and then use that to set up points of contact for communication, to develop greater space situational awareness, to do some of the recommendations that the GG had with respect to notification and outreach, then I think that could really be a positive development, and not just leave that GGE report out there as a good document that doesn't really mean anything. I think that is an important follow-up, and we are certainly discussing that with our allies after the code to see if that's going to be the best source for our next steps. All right, thank you so much. I hope you have a good panel. I look forward to hearing all the opinions that come up.
Thank you, Mallory, and thank you all for coming today. My name is Lucian Crowder. I'm senior editor at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, and I'll be moderating the panel today. First, I'd just like to say a few words about the work we do at the Bulletin, and also about the development and disarmament roundtable project that this panel grew out of today. The Bulletin just celebrated its 70th anniversary last year. It was started by some of the scientists who had been involved in the Manhattan Project during World War II, and saw an urgent need to communicate to policymakers and to the public the dangers of the weapons they just helped create. We're well known for our doomsday clock, which communicates to the public how close humanity is to destroying civilization as we know it through technologies of its own making. The time is currently 3 minutes to midnight, but look out in the next few weeks to see if our Science and Security Board is going to move it this year. We publish both a subscription-based journal and an online open access website, thebulletin.org. I encourage you to drop by to check out some of the top flight news and analysis that we publish all the time on nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, climate change, emerging technologies, and biosecurity. At the Bulletin, I am primarily responsible for the roundtable project that today's event grew out of. It's meant to be a forum for viewpoints from the developing world that sometimes get short shrift in international policy debates to get extra attention. Roundtables are essentially an online essay exchange in which several authors each respond to the same question, offering viewpoint solutions and so forth, and then additional rounds follow so that the authors can respond to each other's ideas and hopefully have a lively exchange. It's in its 5th year with support from the Norwegian Foreign Ministry and is published in English and also translated into Arabic, Chinese, Spanish, and Russian. An anti-satellite roundtable was a perfect fit for us because it brings together nuclear weapons and space technologies, and it's an area where large developing countries play a very important role in the debate. I invite you to read it. Bharath suggested that I might give you the URL. Unfortunately, I can't quote you that, but if you go to our website and search on anti-satellite, you will find it quickly. All right, now I'll just quickly introduce our panelists. I believe in the materials you received today, you have bios for, well, at least 2 of them. Speaking first today will be Nancy Gallagher to my left. She is Senior Research Scholar at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Next will be Teresa Hitchens, Senior Research Scholar at the Center for International and Security Studies at Maryland, and the former director of the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. Originally, Joan Fries was supposed to be speaking in her place today, but she had travel issues, so Teresa has graciously agreed to step in. And last, Gaurav Kampani, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council South Asia Center and an assistant professor of political science at the University of Tulsa. So each panelist will speak for a few minutes, then I will moderate a discussion for a while, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. Thank you very much. Nancy.
Well,
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see properly.
as I was thinking about my remarks, I was trying to anticipate what Mallory was going to say so that I could play off of her remarks. And I was also trying to speak to the framing for today's panel that was in the promotional materials. And what's striking me right now is that those are two very, very different ways of thinking about what the key issues are. Mallory's remarks dealt almost exclusively with debris issues, with promoting responsible behavior, a little bit of a mention of strategic restraint at the end, but not a very extensive focus on what I would call the core security problems. It was more thinking about space predominantly as an environmental problem. Whereas the framing that the bulletin used for the roundtable and for today's session was really looking at space as first and foremost a security problem. And in particular, saying that a number of Americans now think that China has, quote, invested in counter space capabilities that challenge the US command of the commons. So part of what I did to kind of kick off the discussion from what was supposed to be the Chinese perspective, but now it's 2 steps removed, and the Indian perspective was just to take that sentence, right? That China has invested in counter space capabilities that challenge the US command of the commons, and try to think about what that means, and think about whether that's a particularly useful way of understanding what the problem is, or how that problem has changed over time, or what we might want to do about it in the future. And part of what I'm going to say comes out of a project that John Steinbrunner and I did together during the Bush administration that was looking at the Bush administration's perception that the United States could and should achieve comprehensive space dominance. When the Obama administration came in, that way of framing what we were doing got pushed aside, and you started hearing more about talk of space as a global commons, and that the United States could and should somehow do something, right? And it was never clear what that something was to preserve and protect space as a global commons. So if you think about that phrase, right, it can mean 2 different things depending on your perspective. For those of us who are political scientists, we frequently will think about it in terms of Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the commons, that you have this common pool resource that lots and lots of different actors want to use, but as each of them tries to use it more intensively, there's a real danger of degrading the common environment such that there's less for everybody, and that as that environment gets degraded, the natural thing to try to do is to get more of it for yourself. But the more you do that, the more you exacerbate the problem. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about space as a global commons and what the problem is and what it is you need to do about. And to some extent, that corresponds to the kind of debris framing of the issue. The other way of thinking about it is much closer to, I think, the way the people who sort of wrote the lead-in for the panel were thinking about it, and to some extent the way the US military thinks of it, which is that space is a commons in the sense that the high seas was a commons, or still is a commons. It's this environment that everybody wants to be able to use, but there are all sorts of threats and dangers out there, and the only way the good actors are going to be able to use it, right, and be free from piracy, be free from attack, be free from denial of access, somebody who wants to close off their ability to get to that environment, is essentially if there's a benign hegemon, right, that is acting as the one who ensures that everybody has access to this commons for legitimate purposes and that nobody can do bad stuff out there. And I think that's really how a lot of people in the United States space security community, who were no longer talking about US space dominance to advance US national security interests, shifted over to talking about a lot of the same kinds of things, but in the interests of the global community, as protecting the global commons. So I think the first thing to notice is those are 2 really different ways of thinking about what the problem is and what the United States and other countries should be doing to address that problem. Because if you think about it as a shared resource that you've all got responsibility for managing, right? That has the United States perhaps as first among equals, but it has to cooperate with others to develop rules, to develop ways of knowing whether everybody's following rules, to develop ways of addressing concerns if you suspect that people aren't following the rules, you know, the accountability, the attribution kinds of problems. If you think of it as the United States is the benign hegemon, right? It's the global cop, or it's the space cop. It declares what the rules are. It decides who's breaking the rules. It decides what to do about the rule breakers, and it does it, right? Two very, very different ways of thinking about the problem. Has the United States ever actually had command of the space commons in that latter sense? And I would say no, right? That's part of what the Bush administration aspired to, but it never came close to that. Partly because of what it's called the fallacy of, you know, the high spaces, the high ground. You had a lot of people talking about the United States has to seize the high ground. And once it has the high ground, it will have this commanding position that it can prevent anybody else from being able to challenge it. But if you think about what makes space different from terrestrial military operations, in terrestrial military operations, if you're on the high ground, you can see down, you're better, you have more visibility down, you're better protected because it's harder to shoot up and it's easier to shoot down, right? In a very crude sense. If you think about space, it's just the reverse, right? If you're up there, you're much more visible, and in many ways, it's easier to attack you than it would be for you to actually see, track, and attack everything that might go after you. The Chinese ASAT test was a reminder that satellites in LEO are really vulnerable, right? That being up there doesn't give them more protection just because they're somewhat higher than they would be on Earth. It didn't really fundamentally change anything, right? The United States and Russia could already do hit-to-kill ASAT attacks if they wanted to. There were a number of other countries who could attack or interfere with satellites in LEO in cruder ways. But in some ways, the Chinese ASAT test was this very visible reminder that our satellites in LEO were vulnerable. But just because countries have capabilities to do things, right, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do them. And that's the whole dual-use problem. And the United States has spent a lot of time talking about how that means we need to understand China's intentions in space. Right? Like, again, we want to put China in a good box. Are they in one of two boxes? Are they a good actor in space, or are they a bad actor in space? And I would say, again, that's the wrong way to think about dual-use capabilities, because what you really care about are incentives for using those capabilities, right? And what are the incentives to use them in peaceful, cooperative ways? What are the incentives to potentially use them in either irresponsible or hostile ways? So we've focused a lot on space deterrence, trying to shape incentives, much more than we have on space reassurance, right? And there I would say that it's at least as important to be communicating to the Chinese and others how the United States is going to use its own space assets, right? If China is afraid that we're going to use them in ways that are threatening, they're going to have more of an incentive to develop capabilities to interfere with or attack those assets. Likewise, if we're communicating that we would, under certain circumstances, think that it would be in our interest to attack, say, Chinese satellites in LEO, that naturally, I think, is going to make other countries think about, oh, well, if it's in the US interest potentially to do this, maybe it's in our interest too. We also have to think really carefully about how we interact during a crisis to make sure that when you're in a crisis, right, and when incentives to preemptively attack would go up, that there are very, very strong reminders that that's not going to be in your interest to do, and that if you exercise restraint, the other side will too. A lot of people in the US military and intelligence community and in the commercial world that we talked to in the Bush administration, in effect said, well, you know, LEO satellites are vulnerable. There's not a whole lot you can do about that, but that's okay because my stuff, right, is up in, you know, and my stuff is up in GEO. And those are where I would say, the biggest, most expensive, highest value and scarcest satellites are. So they were willing to accept some degree of vulnerability of satellites in LEO as long as the other stuff was beyond the reach of countries that might want to do harm. And we talked a lot about, responsive space and whether or not we could solve the LEO problem by just being able to put more satellites back up there if some of them got shut down. We talked about basically redundancy, being able to replace that asset with something else. We talked about trying to make the argument that it really isn't, there's so many of them that you would gain next to nothing by taking one of them out because there'd be others that would move into place quickly. So there were a lot of people that convinced themselves that we didn't really need to worry about the security problem in space. We could talk about it in terms of debris because there was no security problem that the US couldn't handle unilaterally up in GEO and MEO, and at LEO there were a variety of ways that we could basically reduce the risks to an acceptable level. What I think has really shaken a lot of people up is the sense now, particularly with some Russian and Chinese actions, that some of those satellites up in MEO and GEO may become vulnerable in the near term too, right? And in many ways, that's like the United States losing its geographical invulnerability and all of a sudden having to say, uh-oh, the problem is much bigger than we thought it was. And those satellites, by and large, are very unique. They're very expensive. You can't easily replace them, right? You can't just do the same function with something else. It's the same type of problem that you had in low Earth orbit, but in a much more intensified fashion. So you've got a number of people who before didn't seem that concerned about space security, all of a sudden paying attention, but they missed the entire debate that went on during the Bush administration about why it is that trying to achieve a unilateral military solution to this problem isn't going to work and is probably going to make things worse. So you're starting to hear a lot of the same things being put forward now that we looked at carefully during the Bush administration and said this doesn't make good sense. It's not technologically feasible. It's not affordable. The United States can take some steps in that direction, but if it does, other countries are going to take comparable steps, right? And it's going to leave everybody less secure than they were before. Now, there are some people who will say, well, but the United States is a lot further along than it was, in 2008, and that it might actually be possible to solve this problem unilaterally now if we have a new administration that comes in that really wants to take space dominance seriously. And that now we really have to take it seriously because we no longer have this potential sanctuary for the satellites that we're most concerned about. I'm still very skeptical about whether or not that is technologically feasible. I'm skeptical about whether or not it's affordable, and I'm extremely skeptical about whether or not it's a good idea to go in that direction. It's still true that it's inherently easier to attack and destroy than it is to put things up in space and use them for constructive purposes and protect them. Yes, the United States has made advances in space technology, but other countries have narrowed the gap between where the United States is and where they are on both the technology and the funding fronts. So every increment of progress that we've made, I would say, other countries, if they want to, right, are in a better position now than they were 10 years ago to emulate or offset us. The problems have gotten much more complicated because there are so many space actors, so many more space actors than there were before, with so many different capabilities and so much reliance on space. And that, I think, does create more potential for cooperation, but it also creates more potential for misperception, miscommunication, for crises to spiral out of control, and so on and so forth. You look at space, it is a much more complex place than it was 10 or 20 years ago, and yet our mechanisms for managing it cooperatively are, I would say, less well developed now than they were in the 1990s. And I say that not to put down what the Obama administration has tried to do, but if you think about what we've lost, right? We've got some progress on voluntary debris mitigation guidelines, some progress on transparency in space TCVMs, but not very much on either one of those two. Really, when you compare it to what we've lost, which is, the ABM treaty and any other constraints on missile defense, which is inherently dual use. The code of conduct, right, the failure of that, I think is, even though I don't think the code would have done a whole lot, right, the fact that you couldn't even get that makes other countries very, very skeptical about their ability to cooperate with the United States on anything. And then finally, I think China, Russia, and India are all much more skeptical now than they probably were in the 1990s or the 2000s about whether or not having any agreed restraints in space is actually in their interests either. And so I think we have a big and important problem to talk about.
Thank you very much. Teresa.
Hi, thank you to the Atlantic Council, and I have to send Joan Johnson-Fries's regrets. She contacted me when she was stuck at the airport in Boston and unable to get here. So primarily these are her remarks, but I will say that Joan and I are very much on the same page. In fact, we're going to be collaborating on a paper for the Atlantic Council on National Space Strategy in the coming months. So what Joan says, pretty much I agree. So I'm essentially going to give her remarks with a little bit of a twist. I'm going to kind of start with the whole issue of national military space. We're going to talk about that, and strategic space. It's very true that no country has overtly crossed the Rubicon of developing or permanently deploying space weapons. But several countries, including the United States, have the capabilities for both ground-based and space-based systems, ground-based systems that can touch space. And many of those capabilities are dual use. This is important. The importance of dual-use technology with civil and military applications and offensive and defensive purposes, those are two different sorts of ways of defining dual use. The importance of this cannot be overstated in the space realm. When intent cannot be discerned, worst-case speculation is often the default assumption when you're dealing with dual-use technology. So our concerns, both mine and Joan's, is that at the end of the Obama administration, which, as Nancy pointed out, sort of started out with a very different attitude than the Bush administration, we are starting to see at least discussion of a backing away from the concept of strategic restraint in national security space strategy, sort of with a hint of the primacy strategy that was put together in the Bush years. And this includes the reemergence of the rhetoric of things like space control and dominance, which is, again, Nancy pointed out, study after study have stated is actually unhelpful in any circumstances. Virtually all of U.S. space strategies and policies include aspects of a layered approach or a layered strategy, and that is to deter, to defend, and to defeat. Again, the alliteration and the three. It's very common in U.S. Policy documents. And this has become, these three words, deter, defend, and defeat, have become a part of national security lexicon. You hear it all the time. But in practice, the actual focus has been on, and is increasingly on, punitive deterrence. So deterrence by punishment. You do this, we'll do that, okay? And this goes hand in hand with the return to talk about primacy. And it appears directly related to the 2013 high-altitude Chinese missile launch, which China said was carrying a scientific experiment. And the US claimed was an anti-satellite weapons test. So the ambiguity of the purpose of this launch exemplifies the difficulties of discerning intent. Just as the U.S. is concerned about what the Chinese characterize as missile defense tests and scientific experiments, other countries are concerned about U.S. programs, like the Geosynchronous Space Situational Awareness Program, due to the maneuverability of these satellites. And certainly there's been a lot of concern about the X-37B spaceplane and its unspecified intent. But relating to the Chinese 2013 launch, the US military and intelligence communities have seemed to conclude that not only was it actually an ASAT test, but a test that demonstrated once and for all Chinese ability to reach US assets in any orbit, including in GEO, which, as Nancy mentioned, has been considered a bit of a sanctuary for a long time. Now, study after study and war game after war game have shown that space weapons are lose or use capabilities, since offense is easier than defense in space. One of the early space war games in 2001, a commander was quoted succinctly summarizing this situation. If I don't know what's going on, I have no choice to hit everything, using everything I have. And this is kind of where you get to the nuclear linkage. And that attitude, which is an understandable attitude, is important for several reasons, not the least of which is the subjective consideration of, I don't know what's going on. And that does not necessarily mean an attack on an asset. It could mean one satellite approaching another really closely with perceived hostile intent. And that being the case, you get lines blurred between preemption and prevention, as well as the potential for misinterpretation and mistake, and rapid escalation, including the use of nuclear weapons. This is especially true because of nuclear-armed states' reliance on space-based systems to provide early warning of a nuclear attack. Space systems, however, could eliminate early warning satellites quickly and without warning, making strategic trigger fingers particularly itchy in that situation. So this link between space and strategic assets is key. We often hear about China potentially developing and I can't say this because I don't speak Chinese, Shashoujian, the assassin's mace, while often assumed to be a Death Star or some such gee-whiz space asset. A recent analysis by Gregory Kulaki of the Union of Concerned Scientists of a Chinese second artillery textbook suggests that China considers its missiles as key to victory, their key strategic asset. And if that is the case, then if China feels those missiles threatened, they might well assume the posture of hit, using everything that we have. Graham Allison also recently published an article in The Atlantic magazine reviewing the results of a study conducted on the odds of war between a ruling and a rising power, and not surprisingly, concluded that the chances of a war between the US and China are more likely than recognized at the moment. Yet he also said that war was not inevitable, and to that he said, "What strategists need most at this moment is not a new strategy, but a long pause for reflection. If the tectonic shift caused by China's rise poses a challenge of genuinely Thucydidean proportions, declarations about rebalancing or revitalizing engage and hedge, or presidential hopefuls' calls for more muscular, robust variants of the same, amount to little more than aspirin treating cancer." Future historians will compare such assertions to the reveries of British, German, and Russian leaders as they sleepwalked into 1914. The rise of a 5,000-year-old civilization with 1.3 billion people is not a problem to be fixed. It is a condition, a chronic condition that will have to be managed over a generation. Attempts at management seem to be what is missing from current space strategy. The US is developing and exercising operational side of space, said General Hyten recently. But we have no historical records to draw from regarding what the end of a space war looks like. And if there is one lesson that ought to be learned from Iraq, it is that the US should not enter a conflict without a clear endgame. And I don't think that's currently the case regarding space warfare. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Gaurav?
Yeah, well, thanks. I'm going to, the discussion has moved from norms and legal issues to our conception of the commons. But I want to really focus on the narrow issue of the development of Chinese ASAT capability and the debate that has emerged in the United States over the last couple of years over the possibility of inadvertent nuclear escalation in the event of a war with China and India. And I want to begin with Nancy's, foray into this characterization of the commons. And one of the very interesting points that she made was that the U.S. has never really had command of the commons, simply because there's no seizure of the high ground. And unlike the oceans, where the United States has the most powerful navy in the world, or in the case of land, where you can actually deploy an army to seize solid ground. But I would like to differ with you to the extent is that the commons, that the United States commands the commons simply in terms of the density of use. The United States has the largest number of assets. We use the space for unprecedented ISR intelligence reconnaissance capabilities, and which is absolutely critical for the concentration and coordination and U.S. power projection worldwide, and that is what the Chinese are contesting. But anyway, but to move on, I'm going to take a contrarian position, and I'm going to argue that the Chinese threat is overblown. And that is because the way the debate has unfolded really privileges the technical side and underplays the political context. And if you really look at the political context, I think there is less room for Chinese concern. So first thing, yes, the Chinese advances in developing ASAT technologies are not an anomaly. And they're part of a broader military strategy to contest U.S. command of the commons. And by that I mean command of the oceans, airspace, and aerospace. And the outer space. And all states during peace have access to the commons, but the United States has a unique ability and a capability to exploit the commons that no other state in the world can. And this is what gives us our unique capability to project a power worldwide. And China has systematically sought to acquire military capabilities that would deny us access to the Western Pacific region, the sea, airspace, and outer space. Now, from China's point of view, a denial strategy makes sense because its military is the underdog in any fight with the US. US military strategy in a war with China would be victory by defeat. And the US would achieve this by exploiting its command over the commons to concentrate and coordinate its forces in the Western Pacific and deny the Chinese the ability to do the same. And I think it is unsportsmanlike for us to argue that China ought to fight us on our terms. It is the equivalent of Goliath telling David that he should put on a suit of armor and drop his slingshot and fight like a gladiator. China, as the weaker party, is role-playing David, and we should acknowledge the fact for what it is. This is regardless of whether it's right or wrong or whether it violates the normative reasons. But from a purely military strategy point of view, I just think it's unfair to kind of make that demand to the Chinese. But anyway, to move on to the specifics of anti-satellite weapons and the potential destruction of American space assets and an inadvertent nuclear conflict, I'm less concerned about this for one political and three technical reasons. Politically, I would argue China does not present the kind of mortal threat the Soviet Union did during the Cold War. The Soviet Union's communist challenge was antithetical to our way of life. China, in contrast, is a stakeholder in our economic order. China is an authoritarian capitalist society. It is not yet a democracy in Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis, but we're not in any danger of fighting a global war of hegemonic domination with China. And furthermore, because Chinese revisionism is confined to the South China Sea and Taiwan, any conflict with the US will likely be confined to the Western Pacific. This restricts the political scope of any large-scale conflict with China. One could also go back and analogize using the British and the German rivalry from the 19th century. One could argue that Germany, too, was a capitalist power and was also authoritarian. In other words, Germany, too, was a partial stakeholder in the British world order, and yet a tragic world war resulted. But the difference between Germany, or the German and the Chinese challenge is that whereas Germany sought European and world hegemony, China does not seek to dominate Asia and the international system. Technically, the fear of nuclear escalation comes from the assumption that US decision makers would interpret the destruction of either an early warning or command control communication satellites as preparatory steps in nuclear preemption. And fearing a preemptive Chinese nuclear attack, US decision makers might choose to preempt the Chinese with tragic consequences. The problem with this argument is that satellites are only one component of an early warning network. Early warning satellites work in conjunction with terrestrial solid-state phased array radar systems deployed at 5 geographical sites worldwide. The destruction of one or a few satellites that are part of the defense support program might deny decision makers the earliest warning signs of an evolving missile threat from China, but this would only be one indicator. Intelligence is ultimately a composite of several sources: satellite imagery, computer networks, signal intercepts, human intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, and so on and so on. Just because the US decision makers lose a satellite or two is insufficient reason to assume that preemption is about to happen. Now, the US might reach a different conclusion if Donald Trump were the president, but I'm assuming that's not going to be the case. Okay, so in the former Soviet Union's case during the Cold War, the risks of inadvertent escalation were more likely because of Soviet nuclear parity and because of a nuclear arms race with the US that was out of control. The same does not hold for the Chinese case. Chinese nuclear forces remain very modest. Today, for example, China barely has 60 ballistic missiles capable of reaching the United States and about 83 nuclear warheads with which it can target the United States. By contrast, the United States has 1,600 nuclear warheads ready to go. We have 350 land-based ballistic missiles, 450 land-based ballistic missiles, and about 350 missiles on our Trident submarines. In other words, and we have about 100 nuclear bombers capable of hitting China. This gives us an obscene advantage of 1:20. All right, and the Chinese modernization efforts are a very modest attempt to be able to kind of respond to a nuclear first strike from the United States, and to be able to protect the nuclear forces from U.S. conventional strike during a conventional war. And the Chinese continue to abide by no first use nuclear strategy. So to use a realist yardstick, there are no hardware and software indicators on the Chinese side to suggest that the Chinese is either capable or harbors a nuclear preemptive strategy against the United States. So the dangers of an inadvertent nuclear exchange between India and China are similarly highly unlikely for two reasons. One, China and India do not harbor visceral, territorial, or political revisionism, and both countries treat nuclear weapons as political weapons and espouse second strike postures and no first use. And neither country has deployed early warning satellites or is reliant on satellites for command control or early warning. So let me just wrap up my comments by summing up the main points. One, it is unfair for us to expect China to fight a war on our terms. China will be the underdog in any fight with the US, which is why it is developing an asymmetric war strategy. Two, China does not represent the hegemonic threat the Soviet Union did. And three, early warning satellites and command control satellites are part of a larger network of electronic systems. And the entire system incorporates redundancies and destruction of one component in and by itself would not be catastrophic. Furthermore, China's knocking out of an early warning satellite would be destabilizing if China were a nuclear peer of the United States, or if China had a nuclear first use or launch and warning doctrine. And neither seems to be the case. So I feel far less concerned, of Chinese ASAT capabilities and the link to inadvertent nuclear escalation, which is not to say that I feel less concerned about Chinese ASAT capabilities per se, but I don't see the link to inadvertent nuclear escalation as paramount as a lot of folks do.
Thanks very much. All right, Gaurav, you just made the case that concerns about a Chinese anti-satellite attack against the United States leading to inadvertent nuclear war are overblown. Nancy and Teresa, neither of you spoke to that point. I'm curious what your views are on that.
It's very hard for me to actually come up with a scenario where I think that I think it's, Americans can fantasize about scenarios in which the Chinese would think it was in their interest to attack our satellites. But if you start looking carefully at both their capabilities and what they would actually gain by the types of attacks that they could carry out, which would still be extremely limited, and the kinds of risks that they would run, and the very limited, very temporary benefits that they would get from an attack on a single satellite, for example. I think it's extremely unlikely that they would ever think that that was going to be a smart move. But the more that we worry that they might do it, and then prepare to do it first, that's how you get in the situation that the commander that Teresa quoted was talking about, where we assume that's what they're going to do, and therefore we make preparations and perhaps even take preventive actions that change their incentive structure to the point where it actually either does make sense in some completely different world than I can think about right now, or it happens even without it making sense.
Yeah. I largely agree with Nancy, but I will say that one of the things that's worrying me about the different rhetoric that has emerged since the Chinese 2013 test that went almost all the way to GEO has been coming out of the intelligence community and the military, the DoD community. And I actually had an intelligence person say to me not long ago, strategic restraint is dead. It didn't work. And now we have to respond. And that kind of thinking, which is what you saw in spades in the Bush administration. If you read any of the Air Force doctrinal papers, which I unfortunately did, and took notes, that kind of thinking brings about what Nancy's talking about. It brings about a self-fulfilling prophecy. And as logical as it might seem that the Chinese don't really have the incentives to attack, or we don't have the incentives to start something like that, logic doesn't often come into the game once there's a crisis, and once there's a crisis mentality. Decisions have to be made relatively quickly. And while satellites, the Chinese don't have early warning satellites, they do use satellites for a lot of, for mapping and for seeing what's going on. India and China both watch each other like hawks using imagery satellites. So there's a lot of potential for escalation. And escalation, there aren't a lot of levers for de-escalation in those situations, and particularly between the United States and China, because we don't have the contacts and the communications that we had with the Soviets after 50 years of jostling with each other. So the situation, I think, is actually less stable in a lot of ways than was the situation with the Soviet Union. And that's what worries me. So I disagree. I think there is a potential for nuclear escalation, and it concerns me.
Yeah, well, I think the situation is less stable because the United States might respond in what you say would be might respond anticipating a Chinese attack and then might preempt the Chinese. So the onus really lies in the way we perceive our own primacy. And we need to take responsibility for that. You cannot really blame the Chinese for preempting us or for conducting a nuclear attack. If we decide that the Chinese are going to destroy some of our assets, which might leave us blind, partially blind, and we don't have the best intelligence that we are used to, and hence we make worst-case assumptions and attack the Chinese, the responsibility lies in us. I don't think it's fair to kind of blame the Chinese on that count.
I don't think I was blaming anyone. I mean, if I were the Chinese and I were looking at long-term strategic parity, or hoping to have long-term strategic parity with the United States in a changed world, I would be doing exactly what they're doing now. It only makes sense from a military viewpoint, if you look at this from a strictly military viewpoint. However, I would say that one of the problems that we have is that we don't have, our diplomacy is not as robust in its thinking as is our military thinking. And what we have is the security communities in both China and in the United States, and also in Russia these days, leading policy. And I think that's where we have a problem, where we have to make sure that our diplomatic efforts are as robust as our military efforts.
Yeah, one of the most interesting conversations I had with a senior DoD official early in the Obama administration who was trying to figure out how to think about space and cybersecurity. And this is somebody who came out of the nuclear realm. And he essentially said, I'm a lot more worried about, and again, he was talking about somebody else attacking us in that realm, but he just as easily could have been talking about our own military deciding to initiate an attack. Because during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union really, really clearly understood that even a small nuclear exchange would be a major disaster. Even if you could keep it limited to a small exchange, that would be terrible. And there were very, very few things except national survival that would be worth even a small nuclear exchange. And his big concern was that with space and with cyber as well, to a certain extent, people are thinking about them much more like conventional weapons, where there'd be all sorts of instances where you could gain military or political or tactical military advantage by threatening and actually using, right, these kinds of weapons, because not that the consequences wouldn't be as bad as a nuclear war, right? But there's not the obvious and immediate path for how you get there. So for some people, they'll just happily say, you don't have to worry about it. It won't happen, right? Everybody would know not to follow that step of escalation. But we don't know, because we have even less experience with what would unfold in these circumstances. You know, and I put zero faith in war games, especially when they're war games where, you know, we're having American China experts imagine what they think the Chinese or the Indians or the Russians would do under these circumstances, as opposed to having the actual Russian, Indian, Chinese decision makers, right, trying to think their way through it. I think we're in real danger of thinking that this would all be much more manageable than it actually would be. And to go back to, Mallory, what you said about strategic restraint, you know, during the Cold War, particularly during the first 3-4 decades of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union, I think, both really understood that it was in both sides' interests to exercise two different forms of strategic restraint, right? And they were exercising strategic restraint vis-a-vis capabilities. They could have built space weapons, you know, anti-satellite weapons in particular, much more quickly than they did. They could have had more advanced capabilities. They could have tested them more frequently. They didn't, right? They both had dual use capabilities, and they both made sure that the other side knew that if you push me, right, I can use this as an anti-satellite weapon, but they weren't making a dedicated effort to acquire a wide variety of very sophisticated anti-satellite weapons. That really started changing in the late 1970s into the 80s, and it was the United States that really started rethinking that whole equation, right? And saying, well, as the Soviets start to have particularly assets that they could use for basically naval reconnaissance, right? It might actually be in our interest to be able to attack those assets so that we keep the information advantage. And so we went from saying that it would be fundamentally destabilizing, both to develop and potentially to use anti-satellite weapons, and that we should do everything we could to encourage mutual restraint, to assuming that there were circumstances in which it would be in our advantage to use anti-satellite weapons, and that therefore we needed to have a wide array of different types of capabilities so that we'd have the option of doing whatever we might calculate we wanted to do in that situation. And part of what I think we've really lost in terms of strategic restraint is nowadays, when you hear people talk about strategic restraint, they're talking about it largely in terms of peacetime, right? And they're just assuming that in a war situation, it would always be in your interest to start attacking the other side's satellites. And that, I think, is a big change. So I think we need to get back to a much more holistic concept of strategic restraint and saying it's, you know, the development of the capabilities, it's how you manage those capabilities, what you say about them, what you do with them during peacetime, but it's also thinking much more carefully about what the consequences would be of actually using them during wartime. Because I think that what might be a very limited, very short-term advantage would almost certainly lead to a lot of unforeseen consequences that we would wish we hadn't done.
Can I just
Yes.
echo that? That's the change in the rhetoric that I've seen at the end of the Obama administration, is away from emphasizing strategic restraint and multilateral and bilateral solutions, and moving toward an emphasis of we've not only got to respond and be able to take out the threats that we see others as developing, but we also have to think about the fact that others who might be our enemies can now use space in the same way we can, with the same advantages for tactical forces on the ground, and therefore we don't want them to have that advantage, and the way for them to not have that advantage is for us to take away their space assets. And those are two different things, but they're a two-part push in national security space circles, primarily in the military and also in the intelligence community now. And I think that debate is internal. The White House has been having meetings for several years now about what to do about the increasing threats in the space domain. There's been interagency debate. We haven't seen a new national space policy. We're not going to see one from this administration. What I do think has happened, and I can't prove it because I don't have a security clearance, but I'm pretty sure there's new directives in the classified realm about where national security space is going.
All right. You have something to say?
Yeah, just one last comment. You know, talking about strategic restraint and the way we practiced, and going back to what you said about strategic restraint, and prior with the Soviet Union. Now, the difference between the Soviet Union and China, again, I'd like to emphasize, is that at least militarily and in terms of space, both the United States and the former Soviet Union were peer competitors. And that made it easy, for them to exercise that kind of restraint, because if you take, because both sides could hit back each other. But in the case of China and the United States and other powers, the United States by far dominates the use of space, which then creates an incentive for the Chinese now, for good or for the bad, to undermine the United States in any way that it can, simply because, space has become so critical, not just for U.S. nuclear security, but also is absolutely and utterly critical for the United States to bring its conventional forces and coordinate its forces and deny others the ability to do the same, especially in terms of, because information is now the key. In this revolution in military affairs, information has become the key component that helps the United States win wars and give it that asymmetric advantage over the others. And so that is the reason which creates this fundamental instability. So unless the Chinese catch up to the United States, or and unless they begin using space to that extent as the U.S., there is less incentive for them to agree to strategic restraint. Simply, and even if they don't intend doing something, just acquiring capabilities induces uncertainty.
I think it's a mistake, though, to think that basically what creates stability is a balance, and that because the United States and the Soviet Union were peer competitors, that they had a balance and they didn't have incentives to escalate in a crisis or to attack each other. Because for the vast majority of the Cold War, the United States actually had substantially more nuclear weapons than the Soviet Union did. What the Soviets did have was that very basic level of parity, right, where the United States knew that no matter what it did, the Soviets could retaliate and we couldn't stop them. Right, so they did have an assured destruction capability, and beyond that, it didn't matter if the United States had, 10 or 20 times more, as long as the Soviets had that assured destruction capability. Now, we're talking about a situation where the United States and China are definitely very asymmetrical, but you've still got a high level of mutual vulnerability, and so I think there's no reason why you can't have a stable situation where both are vulnerable. Right? If they're willing to acknowledge that, yes, we're asymmetrical in our use, we're also asymmetrical in our vulnerability, and that can be a source of stability if we don't assume that stability only exists between two equally weighted powers.
I'd like to ask a question about the role that nuclear doctrine might play in all this. One of the authors in our roundtable, Wu Chunse, who's from China, is not here today because she's so far away, wrote that if all the participants in a crisis of the sort that we're talking about had unambiguous no first use policies, then there shouldn't be any possibility of there being an inadvertent nuclear launch. Nancy, I believe you wrote something to the effect that if all countries had unambiguous no first use policies, then the risk of all this should be reduced. But I mean, China today states an unambiguous no first use policy, but faith in it is not exactly universal. So if a nation such as the United States were faced with an attack on its satellites, how much weight might anybody put in somebody's no first use policy when they're calculating what the intent of this attack is?
Well, when I look at what countries' declaratory policies are, I try to look not only at what they say, but with how well what they say matches up with the capabilities they have, how well what they say matches up with their operational practices, how it matches up with their training materials, right? All of those kinds of things. And if they're all consistent, then I'm going to put a fair amount of weight on their declaratory policy. If there's some really obvious discrepancies, then I'm going to probably put more weight on what they do than what they say. I would say that the Chinese have in many ways been much more consistent on this than the United States has. In the United States, not only do we not have a no first use policy and explicitly don't have a no first use policy, but if you look at the kinds of capabilities that we have developed, they're really capabilities that are optimized for attacking first, as opposed to the kinds of capabilities that you would want to have if you were planning on having a purely retaliatory policy. So I think the United States could go a long ways towards making its declaratory policy clearer, more restrained, and to adopting its capabilities and operational practices to fit better with what we say in the Obama administration's nuclear policy, which is that our nuclear weapons are first and foremost, I won't say primary purpose, but we're edging towards that, is to deter nuclear use by others. And if we mean that in the sense of retaliatory deterrence as opposed to deterrence by denial, which is a much more offensive form of deterrence, then there's a lot that we could do to change our capabilities and change our practices to make it more consistent with that statement. And I think that would go a long ways to reassuring the Chinese.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with Nancy on this count. I mean, the realist paradigm is it's not just the statements that matter, it's the capabilities that matter. Intentions can change overnight. And if you look at Chinese capabilities, they have a very modest nuclear force. Until the 1990s, there were barely 20 missiles, Chinese missiles that could reach the United States. And today, they have about 50 or 60. And US intelligence estimates that it will rise to about 100. And some analysts speculate that it might, by mid-century, go up to about 200 missiles. Now, it's again a very small force, and the Chinese have done nothing. If you look at the modernization program, there is nothing to suggest until now that they intend going big. Neither are they developing a counter-force capability. The bulk of the nuclear forces are inaccurate. They cannot take out U.S. missile silos or submarines, command control. They are designed to attack American urban centers. They're the counter-value targets. And this is very consistent with their doctrine of no first use. And they've remained and despite noises from the Second Artillery and the Chinese nuclear forces and the arguments inside the Chinese military that they should adopt a more robust, they should develop a more robust nuclear arsenal and develop a more aggressive nuclear strategy. The Chinese political leadership does not seem to have bought it, and the PLA is only one voice in this whole debate. By contrast, the United States has, aims for nuclear primacy. Actually, as Nancy pointed out, despite the apparent parity during Cold War, the United States was the superior nuclear power, and its strategy was designed to win a nuclear war. Whether the nuclear war is winnable is another question. But today, there's a very interesting piece of data that's available. In the mid-1980s, the United States, one of the MX missile or the Minuteman could destroy a Soviet silo with 65% confidence. Today, the United States can do that with 99% confidence. So, I mean, in terms of the United States has an unprecedented counterforce capability, and privately, I would not be surprised if the United States has calculated that it could actually launch a preemptive war and win it against the Chinese. So I think the Chinese, by contrast, are very modest compared to the United States. So, so the argument that you pointed out to is that if all countries could unambiguously agree on a no first use posture, I mean, this would de-escalate the situation immediately. It would take the uncertainty out.
Now, the United States, if I understand it correctly, has resisted establishing a treaty advocated for by China that would ban all weapons in space. If I've got that straight, are there legitimate reasons for resisting such a treaty? Are there reasons beyond perhaps no particular faith that other countries want to establish it and wishing to preserve one's own dominance in space?
I'd like to talk about that. I think the United States is perfectly legitimately opposed to the treaty draft that's been put forward, the so-called PPWT, which has gone through a couple of iterations. It's a Russia-China draft. It doesn't, it's a very difficult thing to think about treaties that ban hardware in space because of the dual use capability issue. I'm not saying it's impossible. All things are possible. You know, you're not
Saying on-site verification is a little
but
hard.
there are quite a lot of challenges to that sort of a treaty. Not that maybe you can't get there in the end, but there are very, very many challenges. And unfortunately, the language that has been put forward doesn't actually capture the near-term threats, because the near-term threats are things based on the ground that can hit things in space. Those are the capabilities that most people who play in space currently have. And that is a problem. That's a huge loophole. And there are other problems. There are definitional problems. There are a number of problems with that treaty language. Saying that, however, the United States has not itself put forward draft treaty language of any sort that might be acceptable to Washington. So Washington has taken a very reactive position. The Obama administration less so, and I give the Obama administration a lot of credit for beefing up the efforts towards trying to come up with norms and transparency and confidence building measures. These are politically binding, they're not legally binding, and I do give the administration credit because that did not happen at all under the Bush administration. In fact, there was a complete retreat from any kind of discussion of multilateral solutions. So, you know, the Obama administration gets credit for taking it that far. But again, there hasn't been, there's this, we say in our declaratory policy that we'd be willing to accept a treaty under certain circumstances, which are legit circumstances. We'd be willing to accept legal prohibitions of some sort. But we've never really sat down and said, okay, what is that? What does that look like? If we were drafting a treaty, what would that treaty look like? And that we have not done.
You know, I would say that the Russia-China treaty or draft treaty is not quite as bad as Americans like to portray it, because they frequently talk only about prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space, right? And they don't talk about the fact that it also includes language preventing the threat and use of objects against space assets, and that's the from the ground up part. But it is a very lopsided treaty, right, in terms of what the specific definitions are, and the fact that it's focusing on providing most of the most explicit protections and the most explicit prohibitions, addressing what it is the Russians and Chinese are concerned about, not what the Americans are concerned about. I would say, though, the exact same thing about a lot of what the United States and the Europeans have done on the code of conduct and the debris front, where they've been trying to focus heavily on a definition of responsible behavior in space that is meant to stigmatize the type of ASAT weapons attack that China, or ASAT weapon that China tested, without being willing at all to discuss what are either the capabilities or the uses of capabilities in space that would be so threatening from the Russian or the Chinese perspective that they might actually be tempted to use an ASAT capability. And I think that I do believe that there's a role for legally binding space arms control, but that neither side has thought seriously, given the asymmetries in their capabilities and the asymmetries in their concerns, about what package would be mutually beneficial and fair, enough that you could actually imagine it being in all of those countries' interest to even come to the table and talk about it. Right now, both sides believe that the other is just trying to score propaganda points against them, right? So they don't even want to talk about it. And I think that getting beyond the knee-jerk reaction of, oh, you can't have you can't have space arms control because you can't define it, you can't verify it, right? Therefore we're not even going to talk about it. Or I'll talk about it, but only this thing that's defined in such a lopsided way that I know that you won't talk about it, right? That's what we've got to get past.
Okay, I may have time for one more question here. China's official description of the test it conducted in 2007 was that it was not an anti-satellite test, but rather an outer space experiment. It calls a 2010 event a land-based mid-course missile interception technology test. Neither of these descriptions seems particularly illuminating, and as far as I know, nobody outside China believes in them. I wonder how large an obstacle to some sort of bilateral, multilateral understanding on ASATs is represented by this just fundamental disagreement in fact. And I wonder if there's any comparing and contrasting to be done to the skepticism that exists in Beijing and Moscow about the ultimate purpose of U.S. missile defense.
Those two things are intimately linked. I mean, it's very difficult to tell the difference between a missile defense test, one that doesn't actually hit something, but comes close to something, and an anti-satellite weapons test. The technology is fundamentally the same. I mean, that's one of the problems with saying, oh, we're going to have offensive capabilities versus active defense capabilities, et cetera. A technology doesn't know whether it's an offensive technology or a defensive technology. It's how it's deployed and it's how it's used. So it's very hard to say, okay, this is just a missile defense test. Well, it's dual use technology. You can use it for however you wish to use it. And it does highlight the concerns that China and Russia have long had about U.S. missile defense. I mean, they're not stupid. I mean, Russia knows as much as we know that our current capabilities can't really harm them. But there are political contingencies and there are long-term contingencies, and there's the question of where does this technology go, et cetera, et cetera. And all of those are legitimate questions. So the whole business of missile defense totally complicates the ability to deal with the ASAT threat and the weapons in space threat. One last point, I mean, politically, that's one of the reasons that, any discussion of space arms control has kind of fallen flat in the United States because it's very difficult to do something that's not going to be seen as interfering with our missile defense capabilities. And that was particularly true in discussions of early in this administration, but even earlier than that, of questions of banning debris-creating ASATs, which on the face of it would be a really smart thing to do, especially because the U.S. says in its policy, we have no intentions of doing this. And you can talk to anyone in the Air Force or anyone in Space Command, and they will say exactly the same thing. So we have no intentions of doing this because it's a bad thing to do. We don't want other people to do it because it's a bad thing to do. And yet we've not proposed a ban, even if we thought people would accept it, which they might not at this point, but they might have 10 years ago, I don't know. We haven't proposed that because that's going to get in the way of we are worried that it will get in the way of missile defense testing and missile defense deployment. And that would cause a huge hoo-ha on the Hill and a reaction, and domestically it's a no-go. So yeah, they're intimately connected things.
Yeah, I think that the United States does not take great comfort from the Chinese describing what they've done either as being an experiment or a missile defense test, not an ASAT test. And yet that's the exact same language that we've used to describe a number of things that we've done. So, I think we can't have it both ways, right? We may be able to convince ourselves that what we're doing is purely benign, and we may be able to convince our allies to see it that way, or at least act like they see it that way. But at a minimum, it makes it easier for other countries to cynically use the same language, right? And it also makes it impossible for us to say, well, they may just be doing what we did. They may literally just be doing what we did because they're trying to understand what we're doing. And they wanted to know, well, what did you learn from this experiment, right? Or, how capable is your missile defense system likely to be? And the way you figure that out is by doing some of that yourself. And so if we automatically assume that what they're doing is a cover for something much more nefarious, without applying that same possibility to ourselves, then I think it becomes really difficult to have even a very basic strategic dialogue about what's going on and what it means and what each side's concerned about, let alone to talk seriously about any kinds of cooperation that might be mutually beneficial.
Great, thank you very much. I believe it's time to turn it over to questions from the audience.
Hi, Clark Fry, a student at Fletcher School in Boston. Thank you all for your very enlightening talk. I was wondering, you spoke a lot about China and the United States. What role might non-state actors have in the discussion of, say, weapons bans, or, I mean, think of the nuclear issue, that's a big issue these days. So what role do non-state actors might have in this discussion?
Do you want to answer that? You want to answer it? I can answer. Go ahead. Well, we can both, because we'll probably come at it from different directions.
Yeah.
We spent a lot of time during the Bush administration trying to get non-state actors, particularly the commercial space industry, more engaged. And basically what we found out was three things. The companies that had really a lot of money in space and that thought of themselves as space actors, like Boeing and Lockheed, for example, didn't want to get crosswise with the US military because they were even bigger military contractors than they were in the commercial space sector, right? So they weren't interested in being out in front. They were interested in having us be out in front for them on export controls, but not the other way around. And everybody who uses space on a daily basis for all sorts of things that you may not even know you use space for, right? You've got, FedEx, for example. You've got, DirecTV. You've got all these different companies that are using space to provide you with any number of services that you rely on. But they don't think of themselves as space industry. They think of themselves as package delivery, or they think of themselves as entertainment delivery, right? So they don't have a cohesive identity as part of the space community. And you guys, right, don't typically think of yourselves as being a force that could get engaged in this debate and is directly affected by it and has a voice in all of it. We even tried getting the insurance industry interested, right? Because satellites are very, very expensive. And the more that you've got debris up there, the more you have companies who are concerned about anti-satellite attacks, right? You would think that would become a major barrier to commercial growth, and that you would also think that the insurance companies would be concerned about it. And again, they said two things. One was basically, this is so hard for us to think about, right? It's so hard to figure out how do you put a dollar value on this stuff that we don't even want to try. And we might just not insure space at all, right? And that's what's ended up happening in a lot of fronts because people can't. It's such a small segment of what they do, and they can't really figure out for something where you're trying to anticipate the probability of any number of things that have never happened before happening, and then put a dollar value on that, extraordinarily difficult to do. So at the moment, you've got a lot of satellite operators who are operating without insurance because they can't get it. And they're just crossing their fingers and hoping that nothing's going to happen.
I think I largely agree with what Nancy said. I think the landscape is changing, though. And the landscape is changing because of the advent of small satellites and CubeSats. And it's also changing because of the space entrepreneurs, the Elon Musks, the Richard Bransons, et cetera, the Bigelows. I think that if those companies are successful in putting people in space, the nature of this debate will fundamentally change, and the role of the industry will fundamentally change because you have a different that's a different thing. When you start thinking about space debris blowing up a space hotel full of 160 or 180 people, that's a different calculation here, okay? But the CubeSat people and the SmallSat people who are, that's an explosion. It's an explosion of things on orbit that's predicted to happen over the next several years. And that's a very serious problem that is going to require education of those communities and the investment of those communities into the space policy debate, particularly about debris, and that's very important. But it's not just debris. There's another aspect, is those tiny little things become more ubiquitous and easier to use and develop more capabilities through networking. You have the problem of being able to track them, and that's a problem of space situational awareness. And it's also a potential threat, because at some point, those things also could be hidden weapons. And so that's another problem set. So I think we have to think about the changing nature of the domain and why we need to have that sector involved.
Now, I think there's a tendency definitely to say small space is somehow going to be more peaceful, more cooperative. No. But A, we said that in the 90s and didn't work out, right? And B, you said, in effect, two important things, right? Again, It's very easy to think of ways in which these could become threats,
Yeah.
right? And you've got a whole bunch of people who think of themselves as entrepreneurs who are going to be able to succeed where big businesses under tight government regulation have failed.
Right.
So at least in a lot of the other advanced technology areas that I've looked at, you do have a major problem of education, right? And trying to convince people who are engaged in these activities that you shouldn't just have a free-for-all with everybody developing as many capabilities as they can and racing to be out at the forefront and trying to keep regulation as far away from this as you possibly can, that we actually need to be thinking and talking about what types of regulations you might want, right along with the technology development. And certainly the industry needs to be involved in those discussions. It can't be just a government-to-government discussion. But that's, again, part of the reason why I said right now our capabilities are advancing way faster than our ability to think about how to manage those capabilities in a safe and constructive way.
More questions?
I was as an observer at the UN discussions in July about the Code of Conduct, and one thing that really struck me was there was a big bifurcation in how countries viewed the biggest threat to space assets. The U.S. and our allies tend to look at it as an environmental problem, as you said, Nancy, a debris issue, whereas other countries looked at it as space weaponization. I'm wondering if you guys think this means that since the Code of Conduct has been kicked to who knows where, the United Nations General Assembly maybe, is the Code of Conduct dead? Is it going to move on? And if it is, what are our options for multilateral discussions on these types of issues? I know the UN COPUS, Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, is discussing it, but is kind of limited in terms of what sort of issues it can talk about. And given that the United States and China cannot officially discuss space security issues between the White House or NASA, we need to do it multilaterally. So where do we go from here?
That is a really good question. And it's a question you might want to ask Mallory.
Should we make room for another chair up here?
Yeah, and it's a question that I've actually, as you know, been asking around since the demise of the code, and what I see is kind of stagnation with the UN GGE process. We've got some tools, and Mallory said this, and I agree with her wholeheartedly. The GGE lays down some principles, and it lays down some actual actions that can be taken by states individually in regional fora or in multilateral fora, but nobody is leading the implementation effort. There is not a focus group on those issues, and partly because the focus was on the code, at least from the US side, and that was going to be the vehicle that things were going to go forward. The code is dead. It's not going to be resurrected in the UNGG. It's just not, and that's not going to happen. And there might be discussions, but as far as I can see, it's dead, and it's dead for a number of reasons, not least of which was, European Union incompetence in actually doing the diplomacy around this. And I've told my European friends that to their faces, so they're not saying anything I haven't said before. Partly it was a political problem. It wasn't a substantive problem. It's a political problem. And that political problem was taken advantage of by those who wanted to put the focus on weaponization and create that kind of a dichotomy. Those things do not have to be a dichotomy. This is a sliding scale, and you can work on a number of fronts at the same time. It's not an either-or situation. And that's also partly a political education campaign that needs to be undertaken. So in my view, the best thing would be at this point is to regroup and sit down with the GGE recommendations and say, okay, which of these things can we, if I were in the US government, this would be what I would do, which of these things can we lead on, which are things that we think others can and should lead on, because they have a very vested interest in this, and we want this to be a multilateral process. We don't want it to fall into the us versus them thing that the code fell into, and try to have a strategy for going forward next year under the UN processes to get this done.
I would say, first of all, what Teresa said, right, which is that rather than saying, okay, we can argue back and forth about which is more important, space is an environmental problem or space is a security problem, that you're going to have to be talking about the two together and how they relate to each other. And so in terms of what's productive to do in the multilateral diplomacy sphere over the next year, I would say that that's, right, breaking down this dichotomy between space weapons and the space debris is something that can constructively be done. The last year of an administration is always a hard time, right, to be doing anything major internationally. So the other two things that I would say is that this is a really important time for the Obama administration to be thinking about what they want to leave to their successor, right? Whether that successor is another Democratic administration or a Republican administration. All sorts of stuff happened in the final year of the Clinton administration that left things, I think, in a much more precarious position than they otherwise would have been. And it was largely because Clinton people weren't paying attention, right? They were focused on other things. And making sure that that's not happening again is really important. The other thing that Teresa and I are involved in trying to do, and I think there's lots of productive ways for academics, civil society groups, et cetera, is thinking about joint projects that you can be laying the groundwork for so that if you have a new administration, if you have the new energy that comes in around a new administration that's serious once again about trying to move forward on some of these issues, there's some ideas that are well developed that you can take hold of and they're seen as genuinely new. So we're working with some people in the engineering department at the University of Maryland on trying to create an open source comprehensive database of space objects. That would be something that you could have both governmental and non-governmental actors feeding into. And that would be something that you could potentially then build off of in any number of different ways. So I think there are a number of projects that are like that can be worked on in the coming year so that the Obama administration can point to concrete things and say, see, we're still advancing, right? There's stuff that is happening. And if a successor administration or other governments want to pick up on that in the future and make something out of it, then you've got something new that you can build on.
So I almost feel like I should have asked for a seat on the stage, actually, just listening to all of you, because, and I have to say there's a certain clarity that I may need from Nancy on the difference and why we need the difference between the global commons and the global community and why we need to choose between first among equals and space cops, because I exactly agree that I don't think you need to say it's either an environmental issue or a security issue. It's certainly both. And it's so squarely both that COPUS can't fully encompass debris, nor can a pure security conversation. So unfortunately, in my sort of more flippant lead-in, if I focused, unfortunately, on the environmental side, I didn't mean to. I truly see it as a combination of both. I also don't think the U.S. can put itself out there as the benign space cop without encouraging an arms race for the next country that wants to be the space cop. That why should we get the right to be the benign space cop of all? I think that there has to be a different construct from those two constructs. But to the question that I think I wanted to specifically answer is the code as a concept being dead. The code itself, as an EU-developed issue, is no longer. However, I would not be comfortable saying the code as a failure is a failure because it clarified the lack of clarity in a sense of saying, here is what we need to figure out. Here are the definitions we need to work on. And guess what? Here is the overlap between the code initiative and the PPWT. Even those issues were highlighted in the code conversation. It brought everyone to the table at the negotiations to see the importance of this issue. It demonstrated where there was potential overlap. And with respect to the Obama administration's diplomatic efforts, they've been the most robust, I think, in terms of the multilateral efforts on space in the history of the United States. We have space dialogues with more countries than we've ever had in the past. We have very open and transparent conversations with these countries, and we're hoping to expand that list. So we've gotten more people to understand our point of view of looking at space, and we've understood now better other countries' point of view of looking at space, and we've defined mutual areas of where we feel threatened and where we need clarity for where we won't be threatened in the future. So the code opened the door for follow-on conversations. It sort of clarified the principles that we could actually collectively agree upon, which was the application of international law to space, which was a big deal, even though you'd think after the Outer Space Treaty we all would have come to that consensus. But it clarified that that was an issue. It clarified that debris was a very significant concern. It also helped us understand why the code didn't succeed. In other words, people's questions during that code process and legitimate concerns from the NOM countries and others clarified that this approach that we had of an EU and US led process was not multilateralized enough, so that an initiative started by the US and the EU potentially was never going to be trusted by those that didn't have a part in its development. And so that helped us understand a better way to lay the groundwork for future diplomatic efforts. And thus, we've taken the time since the code. We've been very active. We've had many dialogues. We do bilateral and multilateral engagement. In fact, I would suggest people look at some of the readouts from the ARF, the Asian Regional Forum Conversation on Space, that just happened, co-hosted by China, Russia, the US, and one other country. Yes, thank you. So I think it's important to realize that there has been an active push. And finally, the change, if there is a perceived change, confuses me a little bit. The 2010 space policy is still our space policy. And our efforts are still to prevent conflict from extending into space. So I'm curious as to where that sort of change that you perceive comes from, only because those are still our marching orders. It's still what we believe in, what we're trying to push forward. So prevention of the conflict from extending to space is our trying to address all the emerging, concerns that I've heard from you of the U.S. even being different, and I'm just confused where that sentiment comes from. So, I guess I'll follow up that somewhat non-answer and non-question with a question.
I can start on that. I spent a lot of time in the changeover from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration in following internal dialogue and internal doctrinal development, etc. There was a lot that went on even though the national space policy had not changed. And in fact, if you actually looked at the Air Force doctrinal paper that was put out in 2001, it directly contradicted the 1996 space policy. And yet it was put out and it was a public document and it was accepted by the leadership. So there is, at least this is what I've been told, and I've been told by many people involved, there are internal discussions about what to do now. And these discussions started and got very intense in the wake of the 2013 test in GEO. And the Russian shenanigans now in GEO as well as in LEO, and some things that have been going on. Now, I want to point out that these kinds of tests that are happening, not necessarily the ballistic missile test to GEO, but maneuvering satellites, et cetera. The U.S. has been doing that stuff for a while. We have been more transparent about that than the other folks. That said, these discussions have started, and when you talk to the intelligence community, and when you talk to the military space community, and when you talk to Doug Lavero, and when you talk to General Hyten, the words are different now. The rhetoric's different, and I know that rhetorical changes mean something. And when you start hearing words like space control reemerge, when that phrase was essentially verboten at the beginning of the Obama administration, it was wiped off the table, even though it still was in some of the doctrinal papers, et cetera, still a definition, it was not uttered in the public. And when you have people, senior people, saying, we've got a different situation, the problem is bigger, we've got these new threats, we have to respond, how do we deal with that? We now have to think, something somebody told me in the panel, we now have to think about how, we really have to think about the fact that they can threaten us with these things and how we take out that threat. And that's a different, I'm not saying it's a radically, it's not a 180, and I don't even think it's all the way back to the Bush administration, we're gonna dominate space. I don't think it's gone that far, but I do think it's a change in thinking about what has to happen in national military space, and I think it's very apparent if you go through the speeches of people, even Frank. Even Frank's taken a little bit more of a, Frank Rose, has taken a little bit more of a kind of robust posture in some of his speeches. And so I think that that's important, that you parse those things, because public policy statements are not just, well, they're not supposed to be. Sometimes it happens. People go way off the script. But things are scripted, and they're approved, and there are reasons when two words change, and whether it's a policy or whether it's a speech. And I'm not, I'm not saying I'm totally like freaked out and scared, as I can say I was by the Bush administration policy. But I'm concerned, and this is an election year. And in election years, people who have different policies, who wanted to push different policies all along, and those people still exist within the bureaucracies, have an opportunity to try to put facts on the ground for the next administration. And that's what happened in the changeover from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration. And I can see that, people are maneuvering, and they're trying to put rhetoric on the ground and put facts on the ground. And that's a big deal. We just moved $5 billion around in the space budget. We don't know where that $5 billion went. It was said that it was going to go for space control. And I know where some of the money went. It went to things that the Air Force continued to underfund or defund, that they kept saying they needed and underfunded. But a lot of it's not in the public domain. So, people are naturally concerned.
Yeah, during the 2010, the development of the space policy, I think that the Obama administration was smart to be moving rapidly and, in effect, in a fairly integrated way on nuclear, missile defense, and space simultaneously. But it did mean that you had a lot of the senior-most people who knew a lot more about nuclear and missile defense than they did about space, were paying the most attention to the two reviews that they thought were the most important. And a lot of the space work got left to people who were carrying over from the previous administration. And there was a big debate after the 2010 policy came out about whether it represented basically a change in the rhetoric, but not in the underlying policy, whether it represented a change in the rhetoric and the implementation of the underlying policy. So we're going to do a better job of doing what we've done before, but we weren't going to actually do something fundamentally different, or if it really represented a fundamental change in the underlying policy. And again, for those of us who don't have access to all the classified documents that go along with it, if all you can do is read the unclassified part of it, the language dealing with national security space remain very, very vague, right? Very, very high level, and largely unchanged from what it had been from the Bush administration and even the Clinton administration. So that leaves huge questions about, well, how is this being operationalized? And that's where you get into these lower level documents that fewer people pay attention to and that frequently don't have full interagency clearance. And you get into questions about, what are the priorities? How quickly are they moving forward with different pieces of it? So you can say the official policy has remained the same. And I firmly believe that there are some people who very much are still trying to implement that policy the way they've always wanted to implement that policy, right? There are other people who never wanted to implement that policy the way you perhaps might have wanted to, right? They were always trying to do something different. And there's a group in the middle that could have gone either way, but they feel like they've been burned, right? And so even though they were willing to reach out and see if we could have more of a discussion about strategic restraint with Russia and China, the fact that they don't think that the Russians and Chinese have bought into our definition of strategic restraint and are showing the kinds of restraint that we want them to show, never mind that we're not showing the kind of restraint they want us to show, right? That's caused a certain number of people to just say, oh, we shouldn't have even tried.
We were right all along.
Or, well, those guys were right all along, the ones who said it couldn't be done.
Yeah.
Right? And that's not a great situation. But all of this is going on, right, inside the government, behind closed doors, and you only get very, very small hints of it outside. And that's part of what I think is really important, is to try to figure out, well, how do we have more of a public conversation about this so that people do realize that there's some real issues that need to be discussed here.
I just wanted to make a quick, concrete example of what I'm talking about, because I covered the Clinton administration 1996 space policy. I am old for defense news back in the day. And when that policy came out, it was very vaguely worded on the issue of anti-satellite weapons, et cetera. And there was a lot of hoo-ha on Capitol Hill, a lot of, in actually saying, oh my God, the Clinton administration has endorsed anti-satellite weapons. And I was told, in no uncertain terms, by people in the White House who were responsible for writing that under no circumstances did the Clinton administration intend to develop and deploy anti-satellite weapons. We were talking about KEA-SATs at the time, things based on the ground, kinetic energy. And that, that there would be internal documentation at the classified level to make that perfectly clear internally. It was not in the outside policy. Now, okay, I can say that. I believed the people. I trusted the people I was working with. If I didn't, I wouldn't be using them as sources, obviously, as a reporter. But that didn't necessarily mean that everybody who didn't have my level of trust of the officials who told me that there were going to be memos, there were going to be instructions, would believe it. And that's a situation that anyone in the diplomatic world knows very well, that it's difficult when so much of this discussion takes place in a classified realm, and the top level policy isn't always it isn't actually even the most important documents. The most important documents are the implementation documents that are internal.
Well, and a lot of what you heard in the Bush administration was, oh, we're not doing anything different, right? The Clinton administration had already said that this was what they were going to do, and they kept the exact same language, but they started implementing it very differently.
Interpreting it very differently.
While trying to hide what they were doing by saying there was a bipartisan consensus around it. And without knowing the details of what was actually being done and how much emphasis was being put on the various things, you can't tell from the outside. Is it the same? Is it different at the margins? Or is it fundamentally different?
All right, I believe we're out of time. I need to wrap it up there. I'd like to thank the panelists for this very interesting discussion today, and thank you all again for coming.